Hey folks, so I'm going to record the lecture for Module 7, starting at where I left off the class before Thanksgiving. Just in case, because I've already had to cancel one class due to weather. So I'm just going to make sure I have this in the can in case we need it. So we begin here with bipolar disorders. We've already discussed some other disorders of emotion, including the anxiety disorders. We looked at specific phobia, social anxiety, generalized anxiety, panic disorder, agoraphobia. We've looked at depressive disorders, both major depressive disorder and persistent. And now the final one of the disorders of emotion is bipolar disorder. So it is a mood disorder. It's the same category of disorders as depression. So people with bipolar disorders have both depressive and manic episodes. So the symptoms can include periods of depression and periods of mania. Now, we've already talked about depression, so let's look a little more at mania. A manic episode can often look like the person is feeling awesome. So elevated mood, lots of energy, decreased need for sleep. The person can be very talkative to the point where you can't get a word in edgewise. Grandiose ideas, which means they've got like big ideas, big plans, sometimes out of touch with reality. Things like, I'm going to write the great American novel tonight, stuff like that. Racing thoughts, agitation, restlessness, distractibility, lasting for a week or more, particularly for the most common kind of bipolar, which is bipolar 1. So, where does it come from? Less common than depressive disorders. Remember that with depression, we called that the kind of common cold of mental illness. It's so kind of common. Not so with bipolar. Something like 3 to 4% of the population will experience bipolar disorder. No gender differences, which is also different from depression, where we saw more women than men getting that diagnosis. So with bipolar, there's a strong genetic component here. Twin studies show that if one twin has the disorder, if we're talking about identical twins, the identical twin is 3 times more likely to get it than, say, a fraternal twin. So that's good evidence for genes being pretty important there. And it looks like it's a bunch of genes, not a single gene. Okay, so make sure you understand mania and the importance of genes here with bipolar. Now, we're going to circle back to bipolar when we talk about therapies. We'll talk about ways to help folks. All right, next up is schizophrenia, what your textbook calls a disorder of thought. So schizophrenic disorders are characterized as psychotic disorders in the DSM-5. Psychotic means disconnected from reality, right? So that's marked by that disconnection from reality, which means the person is having problems distinguishing fantasy from reality, right? And for schizophrenia, often this is sort of very severe. They're going to have problems functioning in almost every domain. So schizophrenia impacts motor, cognitive, behavioral, perceptual areas of a person. So, impairment is across kind of the whole person's self and way of interacting with the world. So let's dig in a little bit. Extreme alterations of thought, perception, consciousness, psychosis, an inability to tell what is real from what is imagined. So these pictures here, I'm going to be showing you a bunch of kind of pieces of art that come from a website I found where artists who've been diagnosed with schizophrenia try to show us what it's like to have it through their art. So I think they're kind of really evocative here. So let's talk about the 5 major symptoms of schizophrenia. 4 of them are what we call, positive symptoms. And again, just like we've used positive in the past, we don't mean good here, we mean add. Okay, so the positive symptoms, picture a typical person where you add these things. Okay, and they are delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, and disorganized behavior. The 5th major category is negative symptoms. And by negative, we mean subtract. So take a typical person and start to remove certain abilities. So things like social withdrawal, lack of movement, limited monotone, slow speech, absence of pleasure and motivation, lack of emotional responsiveness, lack of social skills, right? Reduced speech. So these are losses, deficits now. So let's look more closely at these positive symptoms. First up is delusions. A delusion is a false belief that the person holds to be true, despite often lots of evidence that it can't possibly be true, right? So resistant to change. There's different kinds of delusions in schizophrenia. One of them is delusions of influence. This is where the person believes that something else is controlling them, either controlling their body or their mind, right? So it could be that they think, aliens are controlling them, or the government has inserted a chip into their brain and is making them think things and do things. Or, the dog next door is sending them messages about what they have to do. So it's a delusion of influence. And there's delusions of grandeur. So grandeur means kind of importance. So it would be something like, the belief that they are super special in some way, like they're the second coming of Christ, or that they're an emperor or a queen, or even on the negative side, that they're the number one most wanted criminal in the US or something like that, right? Something that means they are very, very special. Delusions of persecution. For example, that one is being followed, that aliens are trying to abduct them, that the government has bugged their apartment, that an assassin is out to get them. Okay? So, really, there's different kinds of schizophrenia, and we're kind of lumping them all together in intro psych, but they can look quite different. The persecution delusions usually show up for something called paranoid schizophrenia. Okay, so delusions are these beliefs that are clearly not true, but the person holds them anyway. Okay. Then there's hallucinations. So hallucinations are false perceptions, right? Delusions are false beliefs. Hallucinations are when the senses are telling them false information, right? Seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, things that aren't there. The most typical kind of hallucination for schizophrenia is hearing voices. So it's an auditory hallucination. But some folks have had hallucinations that touch other senses, right? And sometimes there are even cases where the person has all five senses involved. So with these hearing of voices, usually it's hearing overheard conversations, or sometimes there's like a commentary going on about what the person is thinking or doing. Sometimes the voice is telling the person to do things. That's called a command hallucination. Sometimes the hallucination is like the voice is sort of cruel and, nitpicking at them or criticizing them. If you have someone with auditory hallucinations and you put them in an MRI, their brain is showing patterns consistent with actually hearing voices, right? So this is just evidence that, this is experienced as real for the person. Then there's disorganized speech. So speech, the ability to communicate, can be messed up a few different ways. Sometimes it's a word salad. So what we mean by that is just like you toss a green salad, imagine tossing all the words in a sentence so that they're in the wrong order. That's word salad. Or clang associations. Clanging is where the person seems irresistibly compelled to rhyme words, right? So if they say, oh, I like how you sing, then they seem like they can't not then say ring, bling, fling, ding, right? They go out clanging, and it kind of derails their attempt to communicate. Sometimes they'll create words that don't exist. It's called a neologism. And then there's this phenomenon that we call loosened associations, where for them, one thought leads to another and to another and to another in an organic fashion. But to anyone trying to follow their train of thought, it's really hard to understand. So I have an example here of some writing that sort of illustrates loosened associations. It's hard to understand what the person's trying to say, and it's hard to see how one thought has led to another. right, for this person. Then there's disorganized behavior. So again, this is going to depend on what kind of schizophrenia we're talking about, but some people with schizophrenia behave in strange ways, maybe dressing strangely, talking to themselves, laughing, shouting for no apparent reason, pacing restlessly, wringing the hands constantly, etc. Right? Strange behaviors. So what do we know about the causes of schizophrenia? We do not really understand where it comes from yet, although we have about a century of research trying to figure that out. And the research is showing some important kind of leads. And it's also showing that the causes are complex. It's not going to be a simple cause. So, for example, there are biological factors here, genes. It runs in families. Genetics plays an important role. So this chart is sort of illustrating that. It's looking at the um, the risk of developing schizophrenia as a function of the degree of relatedness a person has to somebody with schizophrenia, right? So in the general population, if you went out and grabbed 100 people at random, on average, there'd be one person with schizophrenia in that group. But you can see that the risks go up as the degree of relatedness to someone with schizophrenia goes up. So, for example, among identical twins, if one twin gets schizophrenia, the chance the other one will get it too is almost 50%. So think about that. That's 50 times the risk of the average person. And if you compare that to fraternal twins, where if one twin gets schizophrenia, the chance the other one will also get it is around 14%. Still 14 times the risk of the general population, but not as high as identical twins. If one parent has schizophrenia, the risk of the child developing it is at about 13%. If both parents have schizophrenia, the chance the child will get it or start to show signs of it is almost 50%. So this is all telling us that genes are super important here. But at the very same time that it's telling us that, it's also telling us genes are not the whole story. If genes were the whole story, then every time one identical twin would get it, so would the other, because they have the same genes. It's not every time, it's 50% of the time. So that tells us something else has to be present as well. And it's what is that something else that has kind of led a lot of the research in the past several decades? Like, what is the other thing? We don't know yet. So let's make sure we understand these terms, right? Schizophrenia, the positive symptoms and the negative symptoms, and the importance of genes, right? So again, we're going to circle back when we talk about therapies and discuss a little bit more about what might help folks with schizophrenia based on what we know about what causes it. Okay, it's probably a good place to stop, and I will pick this up in the next segment.